I need to say something about the nature of television before I start, because it matters. There was a time when a television set was a piece of furniture. It lived in your house the way a cabinet did, or a piano. It had weight. It had wood paneling and a glass face that reflected the room back at you when it was off. And when you turned it on, it didn't just display, it warmed up. There was a period of seconds where the image swam into being, like something surfacing from deep water, and you waited for it the way you'd wait for a window to defog. You were patient with it. You accepted that the picture carried noise, that the colors shifted depending on the weather, that sometimes a channel was just snow, and snow was just a channel with nothing to say yet. I think about that now, the patience we had, the willingness to sit with static and read it as silence rather than failure. I think about it because patience is what kept me watching Channel 6 long enough to see what it was actually showing. And patience is the thing I wish, more than anything, I'd run out of sooner. My mother died in August of 2002. Congestive heart failure, which is a term that sounds almost gentle if you don't know what it means. She was 67. She had lived alone in Hargrove, Ohio for 16 years since my father passed. And in all that time, I don't think she changed a single thing about the house. Not the curtains, not the couch, not the television, a Zenith floor console from the mid-80s, the kind with false wood grain and a dial you turned with a satisfying mechanical clunk. I drove down from Columbus on a Saturday in late September to begin sorting through her belongings. It was supposed to take a weekend. It took almost 3 weeks. Not because there was so much to sort, but because every object in that house was a small, quiet decision about what to keep and what to release, and I was not as ready for that as I thought I'd be. The town of Hargrove had been declining since the plant closed in '94. Driving in, I passed the same streets I'd biked as a kid, but half the storefronts on Main were papered over, and the light at 3rd and Elm was stuck on blinking yellow. The video rental place was gone. The ice cream shop was gone. The barber still had his pole spinning, but the lights were off inside. It was a place running on residual momentum, like a wheel that had been struck once and was slowly losing its spin. My mother's house sat on Pleasant Street, a name that had always felt too gentle for the road it described. A narrow residential strip lined with sugar maples that dropped their leaves in thick wet carpets every October. The house was a small colonial revival. White paint over clapboard green shutters, a covered porch that sagged just slightly at the left corner. Inside it smelled the way it had always smelled, like lemon cleaner and old paper, and something underneath both of those things that was just the smell of the house itself. The accumulated scent of decades of living that no product could mask or replicate. I slept in my old bedroom. The mattress was the same. The ceiling had the same hairline crack I used to trace with my eyes before falling asleep as a boy. It was a strange comfort being there. Grief and nostalgia pressed so close together that I couldn't always tell which one I was feeling. I found Channel 6 on the 4th night. I hadn't intended to watch television at all. The Zenith was a relic. My mother hadn't subscribed to cable in years, possibly ever, and the set still relied on a rooftop antenna, the old kind, a skeletal aluminum array that I could see from the yard tilted about 15 degrees east, probably shifted by wind or ice some winter I wasn't there for. But the house was very quiet at night. Hargrove was quiet at night, and after a full day of sorting my mother's kitchen, touching every dish she'd touched, holding every cup she'd held, I needed noise. I needed something to put between myself and the silence. So I turned the dial. Most channels gave me snow. A few gave me faint, ghosted impressions of distant network affiliates, fragments of late-night programming bleeding in from Columbus or Wheeling, too weak to resolve into anything watchable. One channel gave me a steady low hum with no picture at all, just a deep charcoal grey, which I stared at longer than I should have because even that felt like company. Then I hit Channel 6. The image that appeared was dim but stable. It showed what looked like a living room. An ordinary living room, couch, end table, lamp with a fabric shade casting warm yellow light across wood-paneled walls. There was no title card, no logo, no lower third text, no sound at first either, or so I thought. Then I realized there was audio, but it was very faint. The ambient noise of a room. The hum of a refrigerator in another part of the house, the soft ticking of a clock, a settling sound like a joist adjusting to temperature. And then a woman walked into frame. She was middle-aged, maybe 50, wearing a quilted housecoat and slippers. She carried a mug, tea or coffee, and sat down on the couch. She picked up a TV guide from the end table, opened it, and began to read. She sipped her drink. She turned a page. That was all. I watched her for several minutes, waiting for a cut, a transition, a voiceover, anything that would identify what I was seeing. Nothing came. The camera didn't move. The woman didn't perform. She simply existed in her living room, doing what people do when they believe they are entirely alone. I assumed it was public access. Hargrove had once had a community station. I vaguely remembered it from childhood, and public access was its own strange country. People aired anything: church services, city council meetings. A man I half remembered who filmed his model trains for 45 minutes every Thursday. This seemed like more of the same. Someone had pointed a camera at their living room, and Channel 6 was dutifully broadcasting the result. I turned the set off and went to bed. But I thought about the woman, not with concern or suspicion, just with a low, humming curiosity. She had looked so real. Not real in the way television people look real, where even candid moments carry the invisible architecture of framing and lighting and awareness. Real in the way that a person looks when they are truly unobserved. There's a difference. You know it when you see it, even if you can't articulate what it is. An absence of performance so complete it feels almost private, almost wrong to witness. The next night I turned to Channel 6 again. This time it showed a kitchen. Different house. The cabinets were older, 60s or 70s, flat panel oak with dark hardware. A man stood at the counter making a sandwich. He was methodical about it. 2 slices of bread, mustard from a yellow jar, lunch meat layered one piece at a time, a single leaf of lettuce. He cut the sandwich diagonally, put it on a plate, and carried it to a small table near the window. He sat. He ate. He looked out the window while he chewed, and his expression was the expression of a person thinking about nothing in particular, which is to say, it was no expression at all, just a face at rest. It lasted almost 20 minutes. No edits, no music, no interruption. I was transfixed. Part of it was professional curiosity. I'd spent enough years in broadcast to know what I was looking at technically. A single fixed camera, probably consumer grade, with no external lighting and no audio mixing. The image had the slightly green cast of cheap video under incandescent light. The resolution was soft, but the signal was remarkably clean for what should have been a defunct public access channel on an analog carrier, and part of it was something else, something I didn't have a word for yet. Watching this man eat his sandwich in his kitchen, alone, unaware, I felt the same thing I'd felt sorting through my mother's house. That strange, tender proximity to ordinary life, the kind of closeness you only get when someone isn't trying to show you anything. It was comforting, deeply, specifically comforting. It felt like being allowed to sit in someone's house without the burden of conversation or expectation, like being present without being seen. I told myself it was grief. I told myself I was lonely and tired and raw, and the simple human domesticity of what I was watching soothed something in me that needed soothing. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Over the next several nights, I developed a routine. I'd work through the house during the day, packing, sorting, deciding. At night, around 10, I'd turn on the Zenith, tune to Channel 6, and watch. Every night, the broadcast showed a different interior, a different home. The footage always had the same qualities: single camera, fixed angle, no editing, ambient audio only. And it always showed the same kind of content: someone alone in their house, performing the small, unremarkable rituals of an evening. A woman ironing clothes, a man reading the newspaper, someone washing dishes with the radio on in another room. The music too faint to identify, but present as texture, as atmosphere. I began to notice details that grounded what I was seeing in a specific era. The objects in these homes were not contemporary. The television sets were cathode ray, boxy and deep. The phones were corded. I saw a calendar on one kitchen wall, clearly dated October 1997. A newspaper folded on an armrest showed a headline I couldn't quite read, but the typeface and layout looked mid-90s. The clothing, the hairstyles, the brands on the pantry shelves, everything suggested footage from roughly 5 to 8 years ago, give or take. This didn't alarm me. Archived footage was common on public access. Stations recycled content endlessly. Someone had probably recorded these domestic vignettes as an art project or a local interest piece, and the station, or whatever automated system was still feeding the transmitter, was looping them. What I could not explain as easily was the kitchens. I recognized one of the kitchens. It was the 7th or 8th night. The broadcast showed a woman at a table balancing a checkbook. Behind her, I could see a window with a particular curtain, white, with small blue flowers, and beyond the curtain, the dark outline of a backyard shed with a distinctive peaked roof. Below the window, a decorative plate hung on the wall. It was hand-painted. Windmill and tulips, Dutch. I knew that plate. I knew that shed. The woman was Mrs. Linden, who had lived 3 houses down from my mother for as long as I could remember. She had given me butterscotch candies from a ceramic dish by her front door every Halloween. She was still alive, as far as I knew. I'd seen her name in my mother's address book just that afternoon while sorting the desk. I leaned closer to the screen. Mrs. Linden wrote in her checkbook. She paused, frowned slightly, erased something with the pencil's end, rewrote it. She closed the checkbook, put the pencil in a cup by the phone, and stood up. She walked out of frame. A moment later, I heard the faint sound of a faucet running. The broadcast continued for another 10 minutes. Just the empty kitchen, the sound of water, then silence, then the distant creak of stairs, before the image faded to a soft, rolling static, and Channel 6 went dark for the night. I sat in my mother's living room for a long time after that. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the sensation of 2 things that shouldn't touch pressing up against each other in my mind. The abstract idea of watching strangers on an old channel, and the specific reality that one of those strangers was a woman I could walk to in 4 minutes. I went to see Mrs. Linden the next day. She answered the door slowly, recognized me after a moment, and invited me in with the unhurried warmth of someone who has lived in the same house long enough that visitors are rare and therefore welcome. Her kitchen was the same kitchen I had seen on the screen. The curtain, the shed through the window, the decorative plate with the windmill and tulips. We sat at the same table. She made tea. We talked about my mother, about the neighborhood, about how the town had changed. I let the conversation settle into its own rhythm before I asked, as casually as I could, whether she knew anything about Channel 6. She paused. Not long, but noticeably. The community station, she said. I thought that went off the air. It might have, I said. I've been picking up something on that frequency, though. Looks like old footage of houses around here. She shook her head. I wouldn't know about that. But there had been something in the pause, a half-second of something that wasn't confusion. It was closer to recognition. The micro-expression of someone who has heard a question they hoped not to be asked. I didn't push. I thanked her for the tea and left. Walking home, I looked up at the rooftops along Pleasant Street. Several houses still had their old antennas up, skeletal, tilted, rusted at the joints. Relics of a reception infrastructure that had been obsolete for years, but they were still there, still pointed at the sky, still shaped to receive. That night, Channel 6 showed my mother's kitchen. I need to say that again, because the sentence doesn't carry its own weight the first time. Channel 6 showed my mother's kitchen. The kitchen I had spent the day packing boxes in. The kitchen I was 10 feet away from at that moment. But the kitchen on the screen was not the kitchen as it was now. It was the kitchen as it had been. The wallpaper, yellow with white daisies, was the wallpaper from before my mother redecorated in '95. The refrigerator was the old Frigidaire, the cream-colored one with the silver handle, not the white Kenmore she'd replaced it with. The clock on the wall above the stove was the cat clock, the black plastic one with the swinging tail and shifting eyes, which I hadn't thought about in 20 years, and I was in the kitchen, not me as I was now, me as I was then, 11 years old, maybe 12, sitting at the table in a striped t-shirt I vaguely remembered owning, eating cereal from a blue bowl. It was evening. The light through the window was fading, and I was eating cereal for dinner, which was something my mother let me do sometimes when she was too tired to cook. A small permission that had felt like an enormous freedom. I watched myself eat cereal. The boy on the screen, I, lifted the bowl and drank the remaining milk from it, set it down, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Then he looked up, towards something off camera to the left, and his expression changed. It was subtle, the kind of change you might not notice if you weren't watching closely. But I was watching as closely as a person can watch anything. The boy's face shifted from the blank contentment of a child eating cereal to something else, something I can only describe as listening, not to a sound in the house, to something more internal than that, as if a thought had arrived in his head uninvited and he was holding very still to hear it clearly. He stayed that way for almost a full minute. Then he stood up, carried his bowl to the sink, and walked out of frame. The kitchen sat empty, the cat clock ticked, the light in the window dimmed to nothing. I don't remember that evening. I've tried. I've gone back to every kitchen memory I have from that age, and none of them match what I saw. The cereal, the striped shirt, the blue bowl, all plausible, all possible, all entirely absent from my actual recall. That was the night I stopped thinking of Channel 6 as archived footage. I should have stopped watching. I understand that now, and I understood it then. But grief does something to your sense of proportion. You are already spending your days touching objects that belong to someone who no longer exists, already sleeping in a bed that holds the shape of who you used to be, already moving through rooms that are memorials, whether you want them to be or not. In that state, the boundary between what is normal and what is wrong becomes soft, negotiable. You tell yourself that one more strange thing in a week of strange things is not a reason to panic. You tell yourself that you're tired, that analog signals are unreliable, that memory is imperfect, and maybe you just don't remember that particular evening because it was unremarkable because you were 11, because not every night becomes a memory. You tell yourself these things because the alternative is to sit with the idea that something showed you a night from your own childhood that you cannot account for, and that idea has a weight that the floor of your rational mind is not built to support. So I kept watching. The following nights the broadcasts shifted. Or maybe they didn't shift. Maybe they had always been this way, and I was only now calibrated to notice. The interiors I saw were still domestic, still quiet, still Hargrove, but the evenings being shown had a quality I hadn't detected before. They felt extra, as if they were evenings that existed in addition to the ones people actually lived. Tuesday and a half, the night between Wednesday and Thursday that isn't on any calendar. I know how that sounds. Let me try to describe it differently. In one broadcast, I watched a man I was fairly sure was Dale Erickson. He'd owned the hardware store on Main, sitting in his recliner, doing nothing. Not reading, not watching TV, not sleeping, just sitting. His eyes were open. His hands rested on the arms of the chair. His chest rose and fell with normal breathing, but his face had an emptiness to it that went beyond relaxation. It was the face of a person who was absent, not unconscious. His eyes tracked slightly, following something I couldn't see, but absent in the way a house is absent when no one is home. The structure is there. The lights might even be on, but the essential thing that makes it occupied is elsewhere. He sat like that for the entire broadcast. 43 minutes. I timed it. In another, a woman stood at her kitchen sink washing the same glass, over and over. She'd rinse it, set it in the rack, then pick it up, hold it under the water and wash it again. Her movements were smooth, unhurried, almost meditative. She didn't look distressed. She didn't look anything. She did this for the duration of the broadcast, and when the signal faded, she was still washing. These were not evenings in the way we understand evenings. They were something else wearing the shape of evenings. I went to the public library. Hargrove's library was a single-story brick building on Ash Street that had survived the town's decline mostly because no one had gotten around to closing it. The librarian, a woman named Paulette, remembered me from school and was happy to help, though she couldn't hide her surprise that someone was asking about the old community access station. She pulled what record she could find. Channel 6 had operated from 1984 to 1996 under the management of the Hargrove Community Media Association, which had consisted, as far as anyone could tell, of between 3 and 5 volunteers at any given time. It had broadcast city council meetings, high school sports, a weekly church service, and a local interest program called Our Town, Our Lives, which appeared to have been a mix of interviews and community event coverage. Funding had come from a small municipal grant and occasional donations. When the grant dried up in '96, the station went dark, or was supposed to have gone dark. Paulette let me into the reference archive in the back, where I found 2 boxes of materials related to the station. Most of it was mundane: meeting minutes, equipment inventories, broadcast schedules. But in the second box, underneath a stack of VHS tapes labeled with dates and program names, I found a spiral notebook. It was ordinary, college-ruled, blue cover, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. Inside, in handwriting I didn't recognize, someone had kept a log. Dates, times, and brief descriptions of broadcasts. But these weren't descriptions of city council meetings or high school football. They were entries like October 14th, 1995, 10:47 p.m. Garrison House, living room, Ed sitting, no activity, 2 hours 11 minutes. October 16th, 1995, 11:02 p.m. Moreno House, kitchen, Linda at table, not eating, plate in front of her, food untouched, 1 hour 38 minutes. October 19th, 1995, 10:31 p.m. Marsh House, kitchen, boy eating cereal. Looked up at 10:44, held still, stood and left at 10:45, kitchen empty remainder. Marsh House, my kitchen, my cereal. Someone had seen it before me. Someone had watched the same broadcast, or one like it, 7 years before I had, and written it down in a notebook, and put the notebook in a box in a library basement, and said nothing. I turned the pages. The log continued for several weeks, the entries growing shorter, more terse, and then increasingly strange. October 23rd, don't think these are recordings. Lighting matches real-time sunset. October 25th, counted the houses, more than I recognize. Some streets I don't know. October 28th, they repeat. Not the footage, the people. They repeat the same actions. She washed that glass on the 16th too. October 30th, one of them looked at the camera tonight, just for a second. Not the person, the other one. The one standing behind her that I don't think she knows is there. The log ended on November 3rd, 1995. The last entry was brief. Unplugged the set, signal still there, can hear it in the antenna, don't watch. I closed the notebook. My hands were steady. I want to be honest about that. My hands were steady and my breathing was even, and I did not feel afraid exactly. I felt the way you feel when you are standing at the edge of something high and looking down. Not at the height itself, but at the part of yourself that wants to step forward. The recognition that the danger is not just external. That part of you is already leaning. I should have left Hargrove. I should have packed what I could, hired someone to deal with the rest, and driven back to Columbus that afternoon. Instead, I went home and waited for nightfall. I need you to understand the pull, not to excuse what I did. There's nothing to excuse really, because what I did was simply sit in a chair and watch, but to explain why I didn't stop. My mother had died. I was alone in her house, surrounded by the artifacts of a life I had been too distant from for too long. And here was Channel 6, offering me evenings. Quiet, domestic, ordinary evenings from the life of the town she had lived in. The town I had abandoned, the kitchens and living rooms of people she had known. It felt like receiving a message from the frequency of her life, the daily texture of it, the thing I had never asked about and could never recover. The notebook had warned me. I understood that. But the notebook had also told me that someone else had watched, and that they had watched for weeks, and the worst thing that had happened was that they'd become unsettled enough to stop. I could stop too, I told myself, whenever I wanted. That night, Channel 6 showed my mother's kitchen again. Same era, same wallpaper, same clock. But this time, my mother was in it. She was younger than I had ever consciously remembered her being, mid-40s maybe. Her hair was still mostly dark, pulled back in the loose bun she wore at home. She was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot. Her movements were easy, familiar, the automatic choreography of a person who has cooked in the same kitchen 10,000 times. I couldn't breathe for a moment. Then I could. I watched her stir. I watched her tap the spoon on the rim of the pot. I watched her reach for a dish towel, wipe her hands, and turn toward the table. She pulled out a chair and sat down, and her face settled into an expression I knew so well that seeing it was like being struck. It was her waiting face, the face she wore when dinner was almost done, and she was sitting for a moment before calling me to eat. A face made of patience and mild tiredness, and the particular quiet of a woman alone in a kitchen at the end of a day. I pressed my hand against the screen. The glass was warm. Not from the image, from the cathode ray tube, the electron gun heating the phosphor layer, the literal warmth of the technology producing the illusion of her. She sat. She waited. She didn't call anyone. The broadcast continued for an hour. She didn't move from the chair. Dinner stayed on the stove. No one came. She waited with perfect patience, and the cat clock ticked, and the light shifted in the window as an evening I had no memory of passed from dusk to full dark. I wept, quietly, at the way you weep when you are alone and there is no one to perform for, and the grief can come out clean and undisguised. And then something changed. My mother looked up from the table, not at the camera, past it, through it. Her eyes focused on a point that seemed to be on my side of the screen, above and to the right of where the lens would have been. And her waiting expression shifted by a degree, just 1 degree. From patience into something that resembled patience, but was not patience. It was awareness. She was not looking at the camera, she was looking at something that was in the room with her, positioned where a camera might be, but higher, closer, more intimate than any camera would be placed. She looked at it for 10 seconds. Her expression did not change further. Then she stood up, walked to the stove and began stirring again, and the broadcast faded to static. I sat in the dark living room. The static hissed softly. I could feel my pulse in my wrists, and I understood, with a clarity that required no reasoning and no evidence, that I had not been watching a recording. I had been watching something that happened. Something that happened on an evening that was real in every way except that it had never been part of anyone's life. An evening that existed somewhere adjacent to the timeline I knew, close enough to borrow its furniture, its people, its light, but fundamentally separate, fundamentally extra. And something had been in the room with my mother during that evening. Not a camera, not a crew, something that occupied the exact space from which the footage was taken, something that watched with the stillness and patience of a device designed only to observe. I did not watch the next night. I turned the dial to channel 6, heard the faint tonal hum that preceded each broadcast, and turned the television off. I sat in the kitchen, the real kitchen, the present kitchen, and ate a sandwich in the overhead light, and I listened to the house. It was quiet. Of course it was quiet. But the quiet had a different texture than it had before. It was the quiet of a room that might contain a frequency I wasn't equipped to hear. The quiet of being in a space that was perhaps being observed from inside an evening I couldn't see. I looked at the corner of the kitchen ceiling, above and to the right of where I was sitting. There was nothing there. A cobweb, a faint water stain. Nothing. But I thought of my mother, looking up from her chair, and I thought of the expression on her face, patience shifting into awareness. And I understood that she had seen something there. Not with alarm, not with horror, with the quiet recognition of a person who has noticed something they have been trying not to notice for a long time. I did not look at that corner again. On what I believe was my 16th night in Hargrove, I broke my fast and turned to channel 6 one final time. I need to tell you why. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't compulsion. It was something the notebook had mentioned that I hadn't been able to stop thinking about. More houses than I recognize. Some streets I don't know. The person who wrote the log had seen interiors they couldn't place in Hargrove. Homes from streets that didn't exist. This detail had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter because it implied something about the scope of what Channel 6 was broadcasting. If the channel showed evenings from houses that weren't in Hargrove, then it wasn't simply documenting this town. It was documenting something larger. Or it was documenting evenings that existed in a version of Hargrove that had more streets, more houses, more rooms than the one I knew. Either way, I needed to see. I turned the dial. The hum rose. The image surfaced. It was a living room I didn't recognize. That alone was unremarkable. There were plenty of homes in Hargrove I'd never been inside. But the architecture was wrong. The ceiling was too high. The proportions of the room were slightly elongated, as if someone had taken a normal living room and stretched it by 10% along its longest axis. The wallpaper was a pattern I'd never seen, pale green with a repeating motif that might have been leaves or might have been hands, depending on how my eyes chose to resolve it. A man sat on the couch. He was middle-aged, dressed in the same kind of ordinary clothes everyone on Channel 6 wore. He held a coffee cup. He stared straight ahead. He was not looking at nothing. He was looking at the camera, at me, with full, conscious, unwavering attention. His eyes did not have the glassy emptiness I'd seen in the other broadcasts. They were sharp, present, and they held an expression I have spent years trying to name and have settled reluctantly on gratitude. He looked grateful. He looked at me through the screen and across whatever membrane separated his evening from my evening, and he was grateful that I was watching. I felt cold. Not the metaphorical cold of fear, actual cold, as if the temperature in the room had dropped. The static at the edges of the image seemed to pulse very slightly, in time with something I couldn't identify. Not my heartbeat, not the clock, something else's rhythm. The man set his coffee cup down. He leaned forward. He opened his mouth, and although the audio was the same ambient nothing it had always been, I could see the shape of what he was saying. 2 words repeated. Stay there. I turned the television off. I sat in perfect stillness for a long time. The screen reflected the room back at me, dark glass holding the ghost of the living room I was sitting in. I could see myself in it, a man in a chair, hands on his knees, face pale in the ambient light from the hallway. And for one moment that I have replayed 10,000 times and cannot resolve, I thought I saw, in the reflection, the room behind me as it was and as it wasn't. My mother's living room with its familiar furniture and its grief-heavy air, and overlaid on it, transparent as a double exposure, a second room. Same dimensions, same chair, but the wallpaper was different, and the light came from somewhere colder, and in the corner above and behind me, in the space where there was nothing but a cobweb and a water stain, something occupied the air. Not a shape, not a figure, a density. A point in the room where the act of watching had been concentrated for so long that it had developed weight. I did not turn around. I did not look up. I stared at the dark screen and I breathed and I waited, and after a length of time I cannot honestly report. It might have been a minute, it might have been an hour. The room behind me felt like just a room again. I left Hargrove the next morning. I packed 1 box of my mother's things, photographs, her address book, the sugar bowl she'd used every morning, and I drove to Columbus without stopping. I hired an estate company to handle the rest. I did not go back to the house. When it sold, 3 months later, I signed the papers by mail. I never learned who wrote the notebook. Paulette at the library didn't know who had donated the boxes, and the Community Media Association's records listed only first names and phone numbers that had been disconnected for years. I thought about tracking them down. I decided not to. Here is what I believe happened, and I want to be clear that believe is doing the heaviest lifting in that sentence. I believe that Channel 6, or whatever uses Channel 6's frequency, broadcasts evenings that were removed from people's lives. Not recorded, removed, excised, like cutting a frame from a film strip. Evenings when people sat and stared and waited and washed the same glass and stirred the same pot and ate cereal they don't remember eating, because those evenings were never supposed to be remembered. They were supposed to be gone. And something took them, stored them, and placed them back on a frequency that most people will never tune to because the technology required to receive it is obsolete, abandoned, and forgotten. I believe that whatever watches from the corner of those rooms, the thing my mother looked at, the density I almost saw, is the mechanism by which the evenings are taken. It watches. It is patient. It has been patient for longer than I want to think about. And when it takes an evening from you, you don't know. You go to bed and wake up, and the night between is just a gap, a seam, a stitch in time so fine you'd never notice it unless someone showed you the thread. And I believe this is the part I return to at 3 in the morning, the part that will not let me rest, that the man on the couch who said stay there was not threatening me. He was not warning me. He was asking. He was someone who had been in a removed evening for a very long time, and he was grateful to be seen, and he wanted me to keep watching because my watching was the only thing that made him present, which means the evenings are not empty. The people in them are still there, sitting, stirring, washing, waiting, in evenings that were taken from the record of their lives, on a channel that no one watches anymore, in rooms that exist on a frequency between what happened and what didn't, and the thing in the corner is still watching. I live in Columbus now. I have a digital television. I stream everything. There is no antenna on my roof, no dial to turn, no warm glass to press my hand against. The technology that could connect me to Channel 6 does not exist in my apartment, and I have made sure of that with a diligence that borders on the ritualistic. But sometimes late at night, when I am sitting alone in my living room doing nothing in particular, reading or not reading, or just existing in the amber light of a lamp I leave on because I can no longer sit comfortably in a dark room, I feel the air in one corner shift by a degree. Not a draft, not a temperature change, a shift in quality, as if the air in that corner has become marginally more attentive. And I sit very still, and I do not look up, and I wait for it to pass. It always passes, but last week I lost a Tuesday evening. I remember Monday, I remember Wednesday morning. I don't remember Tuesday night, not the way you forget an unremarkable evening. I forget it the way you forget a word that was erased from a page. The space where it was is clean, too clean, unmarked by even the ghost of what was there. And I wonder if somewhere, on a frequency I can no longer receive, in a room I can no longer recognize, there is a television set that is still warm. And on its screen, I am sitting in my living room doing nothing, looking at nothing, waiting for nothing. And in the corner above me, something patient is watching, and it is grateful, and it has all the time that was ever taken from anyone, and I will never know, because I don't remember.